The 30th of November was the 82nd anniversary of the start of the Winter War. Besides the dozens of posts made by Finns, Finnish history enthusiasts, and a handful of Finnish organisations, the Russian embassy in South Africa also made a post. The post on both Twitter and Instagram was full of inaccuracies, half-truths, and outright fabrications, and the response from various peoples was immediate and not without justification. So this episode is my response to those posts. There has been a trend in the past few years of official Russian bodies making social media posts in relation to the Winter War. The concerning thing about these posts are they contain half-truths or outright lies. For example, in 2019, the Victory Museum posted how the conflict began in response to the Finnish attack on Manila. You can check out my article on the incident here. So I wasn't entirely surprised by the content of the posts by the Russian embassy, but I do believe that it would be beneficial to make a response addressing the claims made in them. Both posts open with the assertion that the Winter War started over territorial disputes. This is technically true, but it is only a one-sided territorial dispute. When the Civil War broke out in the Russian Empire, Finland declared its independence. This, though, didn't mean everything was smooth sailing after that. The Russian Civil War touched Finland in many ways. The Russian communists, while on paper accepted Finland's independence, attempted to undermine it by encouraging the militant left to rise up. This eventually led to a short, but brutal civil war. In the conflict's aftermath, the more nationalistic-minded part of the Finnish White movement took it upon themselves to claim parts of Karelia for a Greater Finland, definitely a subject for a later episode. Some of these activities were resisted by the locals, such as the 1918 Vienna expedition. Others sought intervention by the foreign powers, with the 1918 Petsamo expedition being a good example. Some welcomed the Finnish volunteers, like during the Ingrian uprising in 1919. However, with the Russian Civil War being all but concluded, the Finnish government felt the need to establish relations with the Bolsheviks. In October 1920, the Treaty of Tatu was signed between the two states, using the old border of the Grand Duchy of Finland in addition to Petsamo as the new border. Despite some incidents, the treaty held in place and was honoured by both sides. It was not challenged until spring 1938, when Soviet diplomats requested discussions regarding the leasing of several islands in the Gulf of Finland. This eventually escalated, but we'll come back to that. The Instagram post goes on to mention Finland's hostile position towards the Soviet Union during the interwar era. However, the evidence doesn't bear this out. Not only was there the previously mentioned Treaty of Tatu, in 1932 a non-aggression pact was signed, which was then renewed in 1934, bringing its end date to 1945. Also in 1932, a Convention of Conciliation was agreed upon between the two states. It is true that relations between the two states were not warm either, with trade amounting to less than 1% of Finland's imports and exports. Many defending the post point to the rise in right-wing extremism in interwar Finland, such as the Lapua movement. The Finnish government outlawed this movement in 1932, and while the Isänmaallinen Kansanliike, or the Patriotic People's Movement Party, formed shortly afterwards, it never gained a large enough following to affect the political landscape. Another example brought in is the illegality of the Finnish Communist Party. While it can be argued that this goes against the democratic founding of Finland, this party had a policy of militant activities. Also, its leadership was based in Russia, causing concerns amongst many Finns. This wasn't without justification, as several Soviet embassy staff had connections to the various socialist groups in Finland in an attempt to influence the situation of the nation. The Instagram post continues by stating that Finland had plans for seizing Soviet Karelia. The only possible plan that I can see that could be construed as such an operation would be the Venäjän Keskitys 1, or Russian Concentration 1, document drawn up in 1934. This plan was intended to endanger the Soviet right flank and draw their resources away from the Isthmus as Finnish troops struck into East Karelia. It wasn't designed to seize Karelia. It was a reaction plan and was never intended as an offensive plan. But even if it was a purely offensive plan, this wouldn't be unusual. In 1974, War Plan Red was declassified, showing the US's plan for an invasion of Canada. We know, through the Soviet archives, that the Leningrad military district had plans for an invasion of Finland as early as 1936. This is the job of military planners, to create and wargame plans for every eventuality. The next point in the post talks of Finland's enhancing military cooperation and close ties with Nazi Germany. It was certainly true that there was a bond between Finland and Germany, but this wasn't ideologically based. Germany had sided with Finland in its early days of independence. Many young Finns went to Germany during the First World War and gained military training that eventually formed the core of interwar Finnish military doctrine. There was a strong Germophile presence within the upper echelons of society. Yes, it cannot be denied the Finnish right looked up to the Nazi Germany, but they were more aligned with fascist Italy than they were the Third Reich. When it came to the military, there was very little influence from Nazi Germany, and certainly no cooperation. The majority of equipment was sourced from Britain or France. Strategy was homegrown, using the aggressive ideals of Imperial Germany as a base. Finnish foreign policy, especially in the 1930s, was very British-orientated, and Rudolf Holsti was a vocal Anglophile. Finnish trade with the Third Reich amounted to between 10 to 15%, in comparison to around 40% with the United Kingdom. I cannot see any basis for this claim. The next claim points out that Leningrad was only 32 kilometers from the Finnish border and thus vulnerable to attack. This paranoia does contain some merit. During the Russian Civil War, the Royal Navy set up a base at the Finnish border town of Terijoki, and, using small torpedo boats, a raid was launched against the ships of Kronstadt. Several Bolshevik naval vessels were put out of commission, thus preventing their use against operations in the Baltic. Another reinforcement of this idea came from Mannerheim's declaration in February 1919 to the Allied nations and the White Russians that the Finnish army would attack the Bolsheviks in St. Petersburg if they provided material support and recognized Finnish independence. So, even though this suspicion does hold some ground, it isn't enough to justify the Winter War. The largest field artillery in the Finnish inventory only had a maximum range of 11.2 kilometers, not enough to threaten Leningrad. Neither was the largest coastal artillery pieces of any threat to Leningrad, all being positioned too far to reach the Soviet city. To add to this, Finland's total population was around 3.6 million, about equal to that of Leningrad, and it was not capable of any extensive offensive actions on its own. The post continues by highlighting that it viewed Finland as an ally of Germany in the upcoming conflict. I personally do not see this as possible, given the previously mentioned points. Finland was a big believer in the League of Nations, in helping sort out any international issues. On the 27th of May 1938, alongside Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, a declaration of neutrality was presented to the League. Articles 11 to 14 strictly stated that no nation was to use Finnish sovereign territory for military purposes. The next statement of the post is probably the most egregious. Yes, the Soviet leadership did indeed attempt to make a deal with Finland. This started in an unofficial way in April 1938, when junior diplomat Boris Yartsev contacted Foreign Minister Rudolf Holsti and Prime Minister Aimo Kajanda in regards to improving relations between the two nations and to come to an agreement on Finland's position if Germany invaded them. Despite the Finnish reply that they were committed to neutrality and would defend themselves regardless of the invader, Yartsev, who was actually NKVD agent Boris Brubkin, informed them that Stalin wouldn't be impressed with such an answer. Throughout 1938, Soviet envoys came back and forth bringing new suggestions such as leasing Finnish islands or building defences that the Soviets would then man. All replies from Finland were that it was committed to their original neutrality declaration and that any suggestions given by the USSR would be in violation of it. Finland didn't trust the promises of the envoys. They knew of the Great Purge currently going on, they had witnessed the backtracking on the promises of autonomy for East Karelia, and the persecution of many Karelians and Ingrians. When the Soviet Union made the non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany at the end of August 1939, Finland became more concerned about its position. The next month saw the Red Army cross the Polish border only 16 days after the German invasion. This reinforced Finland's concerns, and then, when the three Baltic states received a summons from Moscow to discuss the establishment of bases and postings of troops within their borders for mutual assistance purposes, Finland was sure that it was in a very precarious situation. So they were not surprised in early October when they received a summons as well. When the delegation arrived, they were met by Stalin. He laid out that the women of Leningrad could not sleep at night with the border being so close, that the situation in Europe was such that he had to improve his strategic position. With this, he went into his demands. The border on the Karelian Isthmus must be moved westward to only 30 kilometers from Viipuri, that all Finnish fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus be destroyed, that the Finnish islands of Sorsaari, Lavansaari, Tuuttasaari, and Koivisto would be ceded, as well as Kalastajasaarento, or Fisherman's Peninsula, in the north. That the Soviet Union would lease the peninsula of Hanko for 30 years and be allowed to establish a military base there that could hold 5,000 combat troops along with their support units. In return for all this, as the Instagram post correctly points out, Finland would receive 5,500 square kilometers of East Karelia, which did amount to about twice the area that the Finns would be losing. However, was this as fair a trade as many apologists claim? The land that would be surrendered contained numerous farms, the land was fertile and contributed a large amount to Finland's needs, especially in certain cereals. The land that would be given was mainly virgin, untamed forest. There had been little development in the region, even with the plans of the 1930s. To make it a suitable replacement, Finland would need to divert significant resources for several years and also rely more heavily upon imports for certain goods. This alone makes the exchange unfair against Finland. The dismantling of Finnish fortifications on the Isthmus, Finland's only defense from a Soviet invasion, was just too high a price to pay. Having just witnessed Poland being divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, and seeing the Soviets putting bases in the Baltics, Finland was rightfully worried about its own defense. The fact that the demand was only for the Finnish to dismantle its fortifications and not for the USSR to do likewise could only reinforce this mistrust. This is not to mention the efficacy of uprooting thousands of people from their homes and then having to support them and reintegrate them elsewhere. However, unlike the statement that Finland declined all suggestions, the truth is different. The government made several attempts to negotiate and explain the reasons for refusing the original demands. For example, Finland was willing to cede the Terijoki area. There was even some willingness to compromise on the leasing of some of the islands within the Gulf. But under no circumstances could they allow the posting of foreign troops on their soil. It would be against their declaration of neutrality and be a Damocles sword over their heads. It can be argued that both sides were being stubborn during the negotiations. However, even with the small compromises on the Soviet side, it is clear that they were unwilling to accept anything less than Finland's bowing down to their demands, and that the pushback was seen as insulting. As the final meeting on the 3rd of November was coming to an unproductive end, Molotov snapped at the Finns. Since we civilians don't seem to be making any progress, perhaps it's the soldiers' turn to speak. A very clear threat, especially considering the Red Army was already mobilizing and putting plans for the invasion in place. The post closes with Finland's defeat. Yes, Finland was defeated, but not in the way originally intended. The original Soviet puppet government under Otto Kuusinen wasn't placed into power. The planned victory parade in Helsinki, in which a special orchestral piece was commissioned, never occurred. The Red Army found itself faced not by a broken, weak peasant militia, but a united, resolute Finnish army. The conflict went from a planned 2 weeks to 3 months, with over 300,000 casualties on the Soviet side. Finland was defeated. It lost its second largest city, a chunk of its industry and agricultural sectors, and 25,000 of its sons and daughters had given their lives. But Finland also won the war. It retained its independence. It showed the Soviet Union and the world what free men can do. As for the Finns joining the Nazis in 1941, this is a very clear example of post hoc fallacy. Until Finland was invaded in November 1939, there was no desire to join the Nazis. There was no talk of invading the Soviet Union. However, the Winter War and its immediate aftermath had sowed the seeds for what would become called the Continuation War. Obviously, my response is in broad strokes. There is a lot more nuance into the background of the Winter War. But I do believe it is safe to say, in conclusion, that the posts made by the Russian embassy to South Africa do not hold up under scrutiny. If you managed to make it to the end of this response, I thank you for listening to my ramble, and thank you to all my supporters. In the description, you'll find the sources that I used in making this response. Once again, thank you very much, and Hausko Joulua, or Happy Christmas.